Welcome back to Dr. Hollowed. Today, we explore eerie tales and unsettling items that people have discovered outdoors. Hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell if you enjoyed the video. It was the night before Christmas Eve. A mate and I had decided to do some last-minute Christmas shopping, and we had just left, heading home. It was late at night at this time, about 11:30 p.m. We were driving down the main road back to my house when suddenly I saw something in my peripheral vision. I looked next to me and saw on the corner of the footpath, just before a pedestrian crossing, a young child, maybe 10 or 11, slumped over a stationary bicycle. He was hunched over it, his arms spread out over the handlebars and his head lolling on top of them, still with the helmet on. His clothes looked old and dirty. He was not moving at all. The kid looked like he was passed out, or worse. I got really worked up straight away as we passed the boy and started yelling at my friend, "Did you see that? And turn around now." I was ready to call the police or someone. My friend was a bit confused but still turned around, and as we went back, he was gone. Of course. We went up and down a few times, back to the exact street corner he was on, but nothing. It was really messing with me, and I wanted and needed to know what happened to him. If he was okay. I thought I was maybe going crazy until my friend fessed up that he saw it too, but I was too scared to say anything. He said he watched the kid in his rear view mirror as we drove past, and he saw the front wheel move slightly, but then he got distracted doing a U-turn and lost him altogether. We're still trying to figure out what happened. We came to the conclusion that it must have just been some kid playing a prank, mainly so we could stop thinking about it and get some sleep that night, but who really knows? I'm still thinking about it a week later. My brother and I used to walk to different ponds all around our house and go fishing. One day, we're walking to a pond about 2 miles away, and most of the trek is along thick thorn brush about 5 feet deep, then woods. With about 500 feet left till we get to the clearing where the pond is, we both hear a loud rustling in this brush about 10 feet away. Being 14 and 15, we get curious and stop for a second trying to see anything, which is about impossible because the thorns and grass are just that thick. Then, we both see a sparsely haired, grayish-skinned hump come up out of the brush, about 5 feet high, and then sink back down. We didn't move, we didn't make a sound. Nothing made a sound, no birds, no bullfrogs by the water, which we were hearing very clearly from much farther away, nothing. Me and a friend were driving to a marijuana dispensary, for medicine, of course, and the road we took was off the beaten path, where we had to cross under a bridge in a construction zone. Mind you, at this point, it's getting pretty dark, the point where your headlights are on but you don't really need them yet. So after we got our goodies and started to enjoy them on the way back, we were passing under the bridge and, coming the opposite way, were 2 full-grown men with black sweatshirts and hoods on a bicycle, traveling pretty quickly, also under the same bridge. They were headed in a direction that really led nowhere. And here's where the creepy part is, they were on the same bike. One was pedaling, facing forward. The other was facing the man pedaling while sitting on the handlebars. I don't know if anybody has tried that, but it is nearly impossible for 2 full-grown men to ride a bike that way, traveling at twilight, down a secluded road, wearing all black hoodies, headed nowhere, and traveling at a decent speed. Me and my buddy looked at each other and both got that feeling when you run up the stairs in the dark at night, thinking someone is chasing you. We don't know who they were or where they were going. Creeped the fuck out of us. Me and a few friends from high school broke into an abandoned house out on this old country road in rural Oregon. We were just stupid teenagers looking for booze or guns. We entered through a window that had plywood nailing it shut, and that led us into the living room. There were boxes full of old clothes stacked to the ceiling everywhere, with little paths in between them that led all over the house. Me and another guy made our way into the kitchen and started poking around for booze. While I was scrambling through drawers, I heard my friend say, "What the fuck?" and immediately start dry heaving. I turned around and saw he was standing at the microwave, inside of which was the exploded body of a cat. Back in my teens, I went on a family vacation to France. We stayed in a gîte, a holiday cottage of sorts. When we got there, we were expecting the, usually English, owner to meet us and receive the payment, but nobody came. However, the key was exactly where we expected it to be, so we made ourselves at home. During the first evening, groups of locals would gather at the bottom of the gravel drive and stare at us, chatting amongst themselves. Our grasp of French wasn't good enough to work out what they were saying. The following day, we explored the area a bit more. Next door's garden was overgrown and the house looked abandoned, which didn't seem particularly odd, but when curiosity overcame us, we stepped over the short wall into the garden to have a nose around. The garden turned out to be a Japanese-style water garden, although completely overgrown and stagnant. There were ill-kept footbridges over small water channels, ornaments, and various little platforms. Dotted around the porch were some odd tools and things, including several pairs of homemade nunchucks. When we looked in through the window of the house, the table looked as if somebody had just eaten a meal. Crockery was in place but looked used. There were a few cups and mugs on the draining board, among other things. The house had completely fallen into disrepair, and everything was covered in dust as if it had been that way for some time. The oddest occurrence was on one of the last nights, though. We'd had a barbecue and were just clearing up after spending several hours sitting and drinking outside, soft drinks in my case, as I was too young for alcohol. I'd been given the task of putting the chairs away into the garage, which had a large wooden door, for vehicles, and a smaller person-sized door inset into it. I stacked the chairs inside, pulled the door closed, and got the key out to lock it when suddenly something wrenched the door open again. Now, there was no wind. There was nobody inside the garage either, as I met everybody when I ran into the house screaming like a baby. The only thing I was gripping at the time was the key, which I'd just placed in the lock, and it was wrenched so sharply out of my hand that it hurt. The only way I can possibly go about explaining it was that I was going over the "wouldn't it be scary if something suddenly moved the door" thought in my head at the time. Perhaps I unknowingly caused it to happen, like a more dramatic version of how people can unwittingly control an Ouija board. I don't know. Nobody turned up to take our payment in the end, and if what I remember is correct, none of our inquiries about payment once we'd returned to England were answered. A free, if somewhat eerie, holiday. This experience made me believe in the existence of other life forms, to say the least. 18-year-old me is walking home from a party in the city I had lived in for 6 months. I was very familiar with the area because I liked to walk wherever I went, a novelty I did not have while growing up in a rural community. It is after 4 a.m. in early fall and still dark, but the morning is approaching the horizon. I was walking along the sidewalk against the cemetery wall. The cemetery was very old and grand, and I loved it and was not afraid, when I saw a figure at the corner or end of the wall ahead. I immediately began rationalizing why the person was swaying into view at the end of the sidewalk and then out of view behind the wall. I'm reasoning they must be on a hammock I can't see yet. And I assumed they were a bit off because they were standing on the hammock using a blanket to cover their entire figure. I see them, but more like feel them, looking at me, and we make eye contact through a grayish smudge where the eyes would be. The sheet is almost like a white, pointed, KKK robe, but not quite. At this point, I'm thinking it was a bad idea to walk to my buddy's house alone, young, vulnerable female and all, and that this crazy, sheet-covered, 7-foot-tall man, swinging while standing on a hammock at 4 a.m. was going to be the last thing I ever saw. I try not to stare while I fumble for my phone and call my sister, who answers groggily. I mutter to her cheerfully while I cross the street, so I do not walk by the crazy man, and explain what I am seeing. She is too tired to understand. I am almost to the street where my friend's house is, and I glance at the figure. I feel the eye contact again. I felt no malice from him, just a sense that I was being noticed. My vision is blocked, for only a fraction of a second, by an oak on the sidewalk. He is gone. There is no hammock, and the wall, taller than the 7-foot man, is gaped narrowly against lots of tangled brush and a house. There is nowhere to go except thin air. I paused, and my sister asked me a couple times if I was okay. I said I was fine. The weirdo was gone. Good night. By the time I got to my friend's house, I was as white as that sheet. I felt exhausted. And didn't want to talk about it, so I just went right to sleep. The next day, I realized it had disappeared the moment the sun began to rise. My grandpa has owned a chunk of forest land for a long time now, probably close to 70 years. He keeps horses on it. One day, when I was a kid, I went playing with my sister. One day, we found a pair of women's clothes. Now that was odd, they were way too small to be my grandma's or my mom's clothing. But we didn't care enough and just moved on. In the same area, we found some ground that looked like it had been buried. We, being the little kids we were, figured someone had buried treasure or something and started digging. We eventually reached cement after about a foot. We dug all around that area and recruited our brother and a shovel to help. Kept reaching cement in a space that was about 4 to 5 feet wide and 7 to 8 feet tall. What the hell? We went and told our grandpa about it, and he just went, huh? Later that afternoon, he rounded up my siblings and me for a chat. He told us, don't go looking for trouble where you don't need to, okay? And don't go telling others about stuff they don't need to know about. When I was 12 years old, 22 now, I got a phone that could turn sideways into a camcorder. I would constantly record everything with that phone. My brother and I had gone over to my cousin's house, who lived in front of a junkyard. We would casually jump over the fence, walk around, and explore. I never got a creepy or scary vibe. I always thought it was cool seeing old cars just left there. Anyway, one day I'm recording all of us jumping over the fence, and I'm the last one to jump, so I give my phone to my brother, who records me. Once I jump over and he gives me the camera, in the distance of the video as it's turning, you can see a human figure kind of run through the grass and through a car before it just vanishes. The grass was maybe up to our knees. It was probably the creepiest thing I had ever seen. I'm not too sure about the history of that junkyard. It wasn't very big either. I never saw anyone working there. But I did, however, show that video to all of my family, and they were freaked out by it. My uncle wanted to go out there at night and record, but I was not for that. When I was in high school, me and my friends used to go out to this road a little out of town called Peanut Road. I'm not sure if that was even its legal name, as I never remember seeing a street sign, but rumor had it that it was a dumping ground in years past for bodies. Having a thirst for spoopy adventures, we often drove out there when there was nothing else to do. Peanut Road was out in the middle of nowhere. Leading up to the dumping site was a tunnel of twisted oak trees, which eventually cleared into an empty pasture on one side and a bending river with thick woods and undergrowth on the other side of the road. We never did find a human body, but we did find plenty of strange things. The weirdest and most disturbing of such was a freshly decapitated calf. It was not butchered. The body remained completely intact, yet at the neck was a freshly bloodied stump. It was so clean too, almost like it was chainsawed off. We found it in broad daylight, and it looked like it had been sitting there for maybe an hour, at the most. Another strange find we discovered was a pile of unopened mail pouring out of an old mail bag. The letters were lying in a puddle, soaking up the mud, and I grabbed a few, almost feeling bad for them. They were all addressed to the same address and so old that the glue on the envelope had simply worn off. I still have 2 of the letters, and they are from the early 60s. They are pretty bland, just describing the weather. Who has hay fever, or what did so-and-so get for their birthday? I always wondered how this pile of letters, all addressed to the same family, got there and why they were never delivered. There is more, but this is getting so long. Though it can probably be explained. The weirdest experience was when me, my parents, sister, and so stood outside, umbrellas at the ready, and witnessed the eye of a storm. We knew something was up when we stared out at the horizon, just above some distant trees in my parents' backyard, at the clouds. Now, these didn't look like normal clouds. They were black, rolling, and fast. So fast that it looked fake. They were rolling, tumbling, and falling over each other like waves, directly approaching us and stretching across the entire skyline. As we sat and stared, quietly discussing how bizarrely fast the skies were, it rained, only a slight pitter-patter, nothing that'd soak you. It promptly stopped, and the wind started. Leaves flew, trees whipped from side to side, we had to hold onto our umbrellas and each other. Then the tumbling clouds had passed over us, and we realized that it was like a large, moving donut, and we were directly in the middle. Surrounding us were rolling, black clouds, but above us was nothing besides a blue sky. There was a peaceful yet eerie silence as the leaves fell, trees stood still, and the world almost stopped. It stayed like that for about 5 minutes, until the other side of the storm reached us and the wind started up. It may have only been a passing storm, but it was sort of peaceful to witness. I used to live in a small town in rural Oklahoma, population 148. Once, a huge tornado ripped through a nearby area but somehow dodged my little town. I basically lived in a shack in the middle of nowhere, most of my neighbors did as well, in rundown houses or trailers. Lots of scrubby brush and trees. Anyway, after this particularly bad tornado, we crawled out of the cellar and started looking around to see if anything had happened. I start feeling a lot of dust and moisture on my face, and my friend gives me this weird look, rubbing my face. My hands are all red. There's chunks of cows hanging in all the trees. Apparently, it went straight through someone's whole herd. I wish I would have had a camera phone back then. This was before those even existed. Shit looked pretty weird. It took us a minute to realize there was blood misting through the air. Eerie silence. Cue Slayer. Lately, I've been thinking about this recurring, vague childhood memory. I have some memory issues due to a variety of reasons: abuse, blackout, previous heavy alcohol and drug use, denial, etc. Please remember that this is very vague. My mom and brothers would visit friends who had once lived on our street but had moved to a farm. I was little, like between the ages of 4 and 7. There was a little girl I would play with named Carrie, who was my age. We would play around the farm, feeding chickens, catching tadpoles in a stream, and farm shit. On one of these visits, I remember it being a beautiful, hot summer day. Carrie wanted to show me something. We walked through the golden, dry wheat fields. If anyone has walked through grown wheat, it's loud, especially when the wind blows through it. We walked to the end of the field, and there was a broken down old, timey wood wagon. A few hundred meters away was a strand of trees on a rise. We sat, played, or did whatever little kids do, and I remember getting very afraid, like cold sweats and chills. I also vaguely remember possibly seeing a dark man in the woods, standing and watching the two of us. This is in the middle of nowhere, prairie farmland. The next town is over an hour away. I can also remember how quiet everything was. The wind had stopped. Carrie and I had stopped talking, blurry here. I then remember us jogging back across the field. I have a really panicky feeling in my chest thinking back to that moment. Did we really see a man? Or were we being stupid kids? I remember the fear I felt in that moment. It was so sunny and warm. Why did I get the cold chill sweats? Did anything else happen that I'm blocking from my memory? A couple years ago, I went to a summer camp in Upper Michigan. So at this camp, you always go out overnight at different camping sites around the Up. So my cabin and I went to Sherwood Forest, not in England, which is a site miles in the woods. It was getting dark after we made dinner, and we went down to the river to wash the dishes out. Across the river, there was a lamp being held by what looked like a hand, but I couldn't make out a man behind it. So my friends and I just blow it off, go back up, and get in our tents. So at about midnight, I am woken up by my friend, who seems very startled and worried, and he says, "Do you hear that?" I didn't hear anything at first, but there was this constant drumbeat going on in the distance. So everyone in our tent and the other two tents were scared shitless. Exactly 15 minutes after I woke up, the drumming stopped, somewhat relieving, until we started hearing gasping, choking, and struggling. No words, just constant choking. Within a minute or two, it stops, and immediately after it stops, there is a very loud screech. Our counselors had us leave and get picked up at 1245 because of this. No one has explained it at camp, and I don't think anyone will. I was fishing a small remote stream for brook trout with my girlfriend. We go out after dinner and fish until pretty close to dark. The whole time we are fishing, I keep hearing what sounds like a conversation from the hill to our left. We wade probably a mile of stream, and I hear it pretty much the whole time. Don't bother mentioning it because I don't want to freak her out. We get back to the car and start driving home, talking about how peaceful it was. I don't remember how I broached the subject, but I bring up the murmuring, and she instantly looks nervous and says she thought she heard it too but didn't say anything. I asked where she thought it was coming from. Toward the road or up the steep, muddy hill. She agreed that it was coming from up the hill. Creepy, but it won't stop us from fishing the same spot again this year. The creepiest thing I found was a large bone that didn't look like it came from a deer. I held it up to my thigh, and it honestly looked like that's where it could have come from. It was way out in the middle of nowhere, all by itself. Honestly, one of the most unnerving things is being way out in the middle of nowhere and bumping into someone else. You have no idea what their intentions are, and vice versa. Everyone has been friendly and usually lost, but you still have to wonder if you're about to be buried somewhere out here. This did not happen to me, but to my friend. She was headed to a party with an acquaintance late one evening. They were driving down a secluded road when she felt the car coming to a very slow stop. She said that she felt almost paralyzed. From their right, two unnaturally large black horses silently and without moving their legs kind of floated across the road. She said that she felt a power or force that was so great that it was terrifying. After they passed, the car started forward again, and both she and the passenger were in a weird shock the rest of the way. They both felt the same weird paralyzation and the same kind of fear when the horses passed. She would love any input on what this could have been. She's tried Googling it with no answers. Any ideas? I was riding dirt bikes on a friend's property, which was, to begin with, in the middle of nowhere. We rode into the woods for about an hour on what we thought were trails. We weren't helplessly lost, we were at least smart enough to maintain a single direction, but we were really, really far into the woods. The friend whose property we were on at first stopped, and we decided to go back because gas is a thing and we were running low. We started back and moved about a mile, and we saw human-shaped figures, 4 to 5, in a circle of trees. This isn't inherently creepy, so we weren't alarmed, but about 100 feet away, one of our bikes stalled out. All of us stopped, and they were within earshot, so we thought it polite to at least wave at them. We waved and said hi as my friend struggled to kickstart his bike, and they didn't reply. More importantly, they looked much less like people now that we weren't moving, as they were totally stationary. I stared and didn't see them move once. There were clear and distinct heads, necks, and shoulders, so, being 17 years old, we rode a little closer to get a better look. About 50 feet away, we could tell they definitely weren't people, but wooden cutouts in the shape of them. There were 4, but we got the fuck out before we saw them all. The first we saw was a plywood target shaped like a human, with outlines of vital organs. The second had clothes on it. They were all just propped up on trees. On the way back to our bikes, we saw a sign that said "Ha, it blows up" with a propane tank under it and some tubes we didn't take the time to look at closely. We rode the fuck away. It could have had a perfectly normal explanation, but none has really occurred to me. I was with 3 of my friends, and we decided to explore the woods behind his house. So we walked down a small animal trail, and it leads to a road. Not like a highway, but just a smooth, perfectly straight road going for about 100 meters total. It looked like someone had started to build a gated community because it had smaller roads branching off. None were paved more than a couple feet, though. So we walk down until we see one offshoot that has thorny vines everywhere, and the trees are all overgrown to make it kind of dark down the path. And of course, we decide to go down that one. We walk down it for a bit, and we see a big sand dune ahead. As we get closer, a big murder of crows launches into the air. Ominous, right? So on the sand dunes, there is a small cross. It's just 2 sticks held together by a little bit of twine, and underneath it is a depression in the ground, as if someone had buried something and the hole had collapsed. Suddenly, we hear a car getting closer. We all duck for cover, but it stops. It doesn't fade away, it just stops. Nothing special, but in the moment, it was creepy, especially since it was getting dark out. I've got a few. When I was in my early 20s, I lived on Oahu with my sister. We liked to go hiking, not on any established trails. We just pick a likely looking spot of woods and start exploring. One day we decided to explore a part of the mountains a mile or 2 from our house. After wandering vaguely uphill through the woods for a couple of hours, we came upon 3 stone cairns. They were good sized, maybe about 6 to 7 feet long, 5 feet wide at the base, and 5 to 6 feet high. And they were old. They were covered with vines and leaf moss, and they just had that worn look that very old stone gets. We figured they were old burial cairns. We stood and looked at them for a few minutes, then, without really knowing why, I put my hands together and bowed as a sign of respect. My sister did the same. Then we circled around them and kept hiking. Fast forward a few more hours. We were starting to reach an area that would have been too steep to go much farther, and we realized that we had lost track of the time and the sun was setting behind the mountains. Well, we were screwed, little idiots. We had nothing with us, not even a flashlight. We started heading down as fast as we could, but the dark caught up to us. Just before the light went away completely, we started to hold hands so we wouldn't lose each other. Now, this was no place to be lost in the dark. We'd passed several crevasses and cliffs that would kill you if you fell off, and it was literally so dark in those woods that I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. We were scared, for sure, and didn't know what to do. Then suddenly, my sister starts walking and leading me down the mountain. I figured her eyes had adjusted and she could somehow see better than I could, so I just trusted her and let her lead. Her pace never faltered, she kept walking steadily and ended up leading us out of the woods exactly where we'd gone in. I let out a big sigh and told her I was so glad she was able to see enough to get us down. Then she turned to me, and her face was white. She said, "I couldn't see a thing." Someone else took my other hand and started leading me. I was so scared, I just closed my eyes and followed. She said whatever took her hand had let go just as we stepped out of the woods. We never went back to that spot. My sister still doesn't like to talk about it. I left the islands more than 20 years ago, but I'd like to find that place again someday. Just to say thank you. There's a small graveyard near my home in Michigan. About 2 years ago, a group of my friends and I went ghost hunting there. It was a warm night with clear skies, and I was raring to catch a ghost on my friend's camera or tape recorder. Even a cell phone video would do. The cemetery is less than an acre, so it didn't take long to scope it out. We broke into groups of 2 and 3 and traversed the grounds. I wandered with a few people, changing from group to group. I felt restless. Usually when we were ghost hunting, we cracked wise, but nobody was saying much. A group near a tall monument, at least 7 feet high and shrouded in vines, called us over. There seemed to be a cold spot about the size and shape of a very tall man. I waved my hands through the air. It did feel a bit cooler, but that could have been my imagination. Everyone began taking pictures, claiming they could see a figure in the digital photos. I hung near the back of the group, not seeing anything. I still felt disquieted. I didn't want to be here. That was when a cold shock squeezed my hand, right between the web of flesh between my right thumb and forefinger. I cried out, yanking my hand away. It hurt. The cold radiated slowly off my hand, and I retreated towards the gate. I'm out. Something grabbed me. I'm out. I was quickly followed by the rest of the party, not so much because of my encounter, but no one wanted to be in there anymore. It wasn't until the morning that the bruise showed up. Deep in the meat of my hand, not a bad bruise, not bad enough to turn black and blue, but definitely there. Yellow and painful, right in the spot where I'd been grabbed by that cold hand. I haven't been back. We both backed up slowly, turned around, and started walking away. After 3 or 4 steps, we heard a very loud crashing sound where this thing was. It came at us very fast, at least 10 feet in just a second. It stopped. We hauled asses without looking back for a while. We finally stopped once we got into another clearing, turned around, and saw nothing suspicious. Neither of us could figure out what the hell the thing was. This was in the middle of North Carolina, where there aren't any big predator animals except for the very rare occasions that a black bear is seen, and 99 times out of 100, black bears run away from people before anyone knows they were even there. The only other wild animals that could be big enough to display part of their body above 4 to 5 feet tall would be deer, and what we saw was definitely no deer.